that clicker work? Thanks, Rob. So, analysing AI, it's an emotional roller coaster. It's the highs of a promised utopia, of growth, and it's the lows of the realisation that our children may not have jobs, we may not have jobs, this may be our last employable year. And I think as we're on this journey of joy and despondency, I, for one, went down to the beach and I took this selfie. And I wasn't alone down there, that we were lined up along the sand. Now, the truth is, we can't bury our heads in the sand like this. We need to look up and allocate capital. And my name's Lewis. I'm the head of strategy at Morrison and also here on behalf of Infratil today. But at Morrison, we sort of are thinking about these issues, AI, and how it's going to impact all our investments across both our listed vehicle, Infratil, which is our largest client, but also our high conviction fund and our other private mandates as well. So with this in mind, I'd sort of like to firstly just what will be a familiar ground, I hope, for people to start with, which is why are so many of us feeling like we need to bury our heads in the sand? And I think the first big question, at least in the near term, which many of us have seen analyses like this, is there a bubble? And so on the left there, you have McKinsey's forecast from late last year around the capex that's going to be spent in the digital infrastructure space, about $1.3 trillion a year. That is 1% roughly of global GDP. Now, it's a huge number. It's not unprecedented in other major infrastructure build-outs at that scale of GDP, about 1%. But nevertheless, how do we wrap our heads around $1 trillion a year? Well, on the right, you can see all this capex is not created equal. A lot of that capex is spent in GPUs, which may have asset lives, depending on how generous you want to be, to the neo clouds of 3, 4, 5 or 6 years. And to recover that capital over those asset lives really does require quite a tremendous amount of revenue. The revenue that of around $1.7 trillion a year, and that actually exceeds the EBITDA of the hyperscalers today. So this cannot be underwritten by existing business profitability. You really do need to believe in great value creation, new value creation. And the scale of that value creation really does sort of need to be, again, around that 1% of global GDP per annum. So pausing on that thought, how hard is it to generate 1% of global GDP in revenue? Well, it's a funny question. I think hard is the answer. But it's not, as this is coming into clarity and focus, the power of these tools, it's not unbelievable. When you look at professional services, that is 5 to 6% of global GDP per annum. When you look at white-collar work, that's 25% of global GDP. So actually, as we're seeing this technology mature, we are seeing that the long-term promise seems to be increasingly achievable. There is still, however, this question in the back of everyone's mind around timing risk. And I think this has consumed markets, and the view on that timing risk is really kind of borne out in the next slide on the left. And this is data slightly old. I mean, old in the context of the way that AI is changing is no more than 6 months old. But if you look on that data on the left, here was usage of these tools. And what is very interesting is the headline numbers that many of these AI LLM companies publicise show high usage, high monthly active users, but daily active users much smaller. The point being, at least mid last year, not that many people had integrated these tools into their day-to-day life. In fact, they had been much more occasional use, make a funny video, make a picture of yourself with your head in the sand, but not actually a daily tool. But I think what we've seen in the last 3 months is a real change in that. And for those who've been playing with these tools actively, it has been quite incredible to see, in particular, Claude Code and Claude Cowork and some of those tools, if you've played with them, a real step change in the usefulness of what we're seeing come out. And I think this question of long-term value and even timing risk is starting to fade from investors' minds as the gap between what technologists are saying and what financial markets are saying will show me the GDP growth, show me the FTE reductions. That gap is closing. And some indications of that gap closing, you can see the massive impact in just 2 months on SaaS prices across a range of SaaS businesses. And for those who've played with the tools, as I have, I am not a software engineer, yet last weekend my brother and I built a fully native iOS app and Android app deployed in one day, with a full back end, and we really do not have any specific technical skill whatsoever, yet you can go out there and you can build yourself quite a sophisticated bit of software just using native language. It's quite incredible. And thus that big sell-off in SaaS. And then you're also seeing just that renewed vigor from the hyperscalers in their recent guidance announcements at the start of this year. So those two leading indicators where we're starting to see, yes, this is really becoming real. And I think the fear factor as well, that each of us should fear for, well, this has happened to software jobs. Is it coming next for my job? So I think that is the first sort of observation to make, is that timing risk, while is still the key thing dominating financial markets, is starting to close out. And I think the second sort of point to make is, if that is true, that we are starting to see these tools mature and become very useful, we should ask ourselves, well, sort of what is next for us as societies? And I think this is a very important question, and a question that's dominating a range of thinking. And maybe the best way to put it is, if labour loses its value, then what matters? Power is all that matters, is the cynic's answer to that question. And that means we should be gathering power as individuals to make sure if our kids cannot get a job, at least they have wealth to fall back on. As investors, as supply chains reshape, what are going to remain the powerful positions in those supply chains where returns will still be attractive? And as countries and sovereigns, and we're seeing countries around the world do this, from Thailand and Malaysia, Australia, Korea, subsidies to attract data center investment to their shores, attract energy investment to their shores. And so that thought about grabbing power and having powerful defensive positions is really governing a lot of how investors are thinking broadly. It's a scary proposition, I think. It's a proposition that says, well, if labour doesn't matter, how does the capitalist system evolve? Do we still have a reason to have incentives and differential wealth in the system when we're not trying to incentivise people to try hard, because people's effort is less relevant? And I think it's also a challenge for democracy. And we saw this same sentiment expressed by Woodrow Wilson back at the height of the Gilded Age, where the Carnegies and the Rockefellers were concentrating global wealth. And then 100 years ago, in his words, if there are people big enough to own the government, they're going to own it if they can. And we have to make up our minds whether we're big enough and strong enough and free enough to take possession of that government, which is our own. So that's really the other challenge that is coming. And I think sovereigns around the world are on the horns of that dilemma. That is, driving investment in their economies to capture the powerful positions in this transformation, and at the same time thinking about regulation. And so there's a big opportunity for that for us as infrastructure investors. And there's also a new set of risks we need to think about as we think about regulatory change and taxation change. So I don't have long today. I've got just a few more minutes. How should we move forward in the face of this uncertainty, that near-term uncertainty and that long-term uncertainty? And I'd like to propose sort of two ways we're thinking about it at Infratil and Morrison. The first is, in the face of uncertainty, one should focus on the fundamentals. And that means defensiveness, downside, and risk management are critical and have increased value in your portfolio. The second is option value. When uncertainty increases, option value rises. So how do we find real options and investments that can show asymmetric upside in the face of this more uncertain environment we find ourselves in? The other thought is, prior technology transformations have generated new winners. Massive creative destruction and the emergence of new positions that have then persisted for decades, or in some cases centuries, in the case of the railroads, for instance. how do you position yourself to get ahead of that next wave of infrastructure-like businesses that will be built with a new means of production system? Finally, one final thought is what remains scarce. We should build those businesses, those investment positions, on the top of the assets that remain scarce. We're going into a world of digital plenty. What remains scarce? Where can we say value is going to aggregate in this new world? So on the left-hand side of that focus on fundamentals, here is a chart that shows 3,000 industries in Australia. And across the x-axis, you can see their concentration. So a few observations. Most industries in Australia are competitive. The vast majority are competitive. And then up the end is a small portion, 4 or 5% of industries that are quite concentrated in their industry structure. And if you think about what is coming for these industries, this large transformation, down the bottom end, there's going to be a huge shakeout, a lot of competitive pressure. And up the top, there's this really attractive characteristic of infrastructure that we're all aware of in this room. That characteristic that says, I have pricing power, the ability to pass through changes to my costs and capex into and protect my margins by doing that. I have economies of scale, which allows me to integrate that technology in a privileged way into my operations and not be disrupted by a new entrant that comes in. And I think we have essential services, which means hopefully you're reasonably agnostic to the changes that are going to come through a new production system. So when we look at this, we think it's imperative really for investors to understand that those assets that have those physical defensive characteristics at the top there in concentrated market structures have become a lot more attractive as part of a portfolio composition. The second point is, where should we really be looking? I think at the top of the green there, because up in that red, you're talking about regulated assets where the advantages you might get from compressing your cost structure need to be passed back to regulators. And at the bottom, in competitive assets, the advantages you get from reinventing yourself need to be passed back to customers. But in that middle part, there's a real opportunity to compress costs and drive efficiency and then hold on to that advantage for the long term, expanding margins. So there really is an attractive space there of origination effort for us as infrastructure investors to be thinking about how do we hold those assets that have the ability to compress costs and win, but also in the meantime can afford to be patient. And that's what I meant by option value. They can sit there. If AI takes a year or two longer to show up, the business doesn't blow up. There's no chance of disruption. And then as the tools emerge, you're capable of capturing those gains and holding them and sustained margins because of market structure. So I do think there's a really attractive opportunity there for infrastructure. The other opportunity that is worth discussing is where is there going to be new green fields to be found? If we look on the left, this is the change over the internet revolution in what would have been before the internet, deeply uncorrelated industries. Yet there's 50, 60, 70% reduction in the number of firms in those industries over a 30-year period. So vast destruction of many, many industries on the back of a foundational technology like AI. I think we're going to see this again over a compressed time frame. And industries that we thought of as uncorrelated previously in your equities portfolio are going to become much more correlated to this single technology trend. So we need to think amongst ourselves then, well, where are the new defensive positions likely to emerge? And there's a few here that are really worth investigating and that we are investigating actively. This is a grab bag of ideas, not exhaustive, but transportation. We heard earlier about Waymo. I too, the last time I was in the States, took a Waymo. It is a surreal and kind of quite inspiring experience, really. But you can already see Waymo there passing through Lyft in terms of market share in the San Francisco Bay Area. So AVs, who is going to manage those fleets? Who is going to own those fleets? Automated supply chains. The combination of robotics technology coupled with a sovereign imperative to bring supply chains back on shore as the consumer electronics value chain becomes inseparable from the military value chain. And that's what we've really learned from Ukraine. is that the drone is the most cost-effective military weapon, and therefore to have a totally outsourced consumer electronics value chain is a military liability. So bringing back onshore manufacturing, bringing back onshore automated logistics to serve a consumer that is now wants same-day delivery to their house for all products is a big opportunity. And there will be local economies that are established around that opportunity. Financial systems are also a very interesting and emerging space. As we move to agentic systems, what does it mean in terms of our ability to allow these agents to transact? What are the payment systems that will work? So these are the emerging at the top end of infrastructure risk spectrum, but areas to watch and areas that are being investigated actively. Thank you. I'm out of time, but appreciate it, and hopefully you can have some questions. And if not, I'm told there's drinks and afternoon tea outside.